Welcome to 10 by 10 series number 2 Merano. This is the second video titled, Shadow of Deleuze. The contemporary trend of philosophy and science is undoubtedly a process and mechanism to create a new different connected outcome. 2 centuries after the dawn of the modern era, science developed the idea of constantly evolving energy via interaction using force, while philosophy similarly pursues the evolving vital energy and force. It seems obvious that science and philosophy will continue to search for a way to unify the material and mind process. Many philosophical scientists find where to start using already existing scientific discoveries. Deleuze's concept of the rhizome is criticized for being too abstract and doesn't provide a clear explanation of how these connections are made. For example, the philosopher Manuel de Landa, who taught at Columbia University, has argued that Deleuze's concept of the rhizome lacks a clear mechanism for how connections are established and maintained, so too vague and abstract. Similarly, the philosopher Brian Massumi has argued that Deleuze's concept of the rhizome is too abstract and too reliant on metaphor, making it difficult to apply in practical situations. According to Aristotle, a new object is made using existing materials and applying a certain force or technique to transform those materials into the desired form. Aristotle believed that the efficient cause was not just a physical force, but also a kind of goal or purpose that the agent had in mind. He also believed that there were various types of bonding forces or principles that could unite different forms or matter. Aristotle believed that the cohesive force between the different elements of the universe was the principle of love, physical force and moral principle, referred to as philia, creating a harmonious whole. Anaximander, who influenced Aristotle, believed that the universe was made up of opposites such as hot and cold, and that these opposites were held in balance by a neutral force called apeiron. The apeiron was infinite and eternal, and that it was responsible for the motion and transformation of the universe. Anaxagoras, on the other hand, believed that the universe was composed of an infinite number of small particles called seeds, and that these seeds interacted with each other through the forces of love and hatred. Pythagoras believed that the universe was composed of mathematical principles and that these principles were responsible for the harmony and order of the universe. He believed that the interaction between these mathematical principles was guided by the forces of love and hatred. Democritus believed that atoms were in constant motion, and that they interacted with each other through collisions. He believed that atoms could combine to form larger particles, and that these particles could be broken down into smaller atoms governed by natural laws. Atoms of different shapes and sizes would interact with each other differently, and this would determine the properties of different materials. Influenced by these predecessors, Plato believed that the interaction between fundamental entities was ultimately guided by a higher reality that was beyond the world of appearances. According to Plato, the world we see around us was only a shadow or copy of a higher reality that existed in a realm. Spinoza believed that the interaction between fundamental entities was ultimately governed by a single, all-encompassing substance, which he referred to as God or nature. According to Spinoza, everything that exists is an expression of this underlying substance, and the apparent diversity and plurality of the world was only an illusion. He believed that the interaction between entities was ultimately determined by the laws of nature and could be understood through reason alone. Leibniz believed that the interaction between fundamental entities was governed by a principle he called pre-established harmony, perfectly synchronized with all the others in the universe by God to maximize the harmony and coherence. Locke, in his book, An Essay Concerning Human Understanding, Locke argues that all knowledge is derived from sensory experience. He believed that the mind at birth is a blank slate, or tabula rasa, and that all knowledge and ideas come from the external world through experience. Kant argued that the interaction between fundamental entities was only possible through the mediation of the mind. According to Kant, the mind imposes certain categories and concepts onto the raw data provided by the senses, which allows us to perceive and understand the world around us. He believed that our experience of the world is filtered through the structures of the mind, which are innate and universal. Piaget believed that children develop knowledge through their interactions with the environment and that their understanding of the world becomes more sophisticated as they grow and develop. Hegel believed that the interaction between fundamental entities was a necessary part of the process. According to Hegel, the universe is a constantly evolving entity that moves through a series of stages, each of which is characterized by a particular form of consciousness. He believed that this process of evolution was driven by a dialectical tension between opposing forces, which eventually resulted in a synthesis of the two. Schopenhauer believed that the interaction between fundamental entities was characterized by an inherent conflict. In his book, Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche argues that all knowledge is perspectival and that there is no objective truth. He believed that ideas and thoughts are constructed by individual perspectives, and that there are multiple, competing perspectives on any given subject. Bergson believed that reality was not a static, fixed entity but rather a constantly evolving process. According to Bergson, the interaction between fundamental entities occurs through a process of continuous creation and destruction that influenced Deleuze seriously. He believed that matter and spirit were not separate entities but rather different aspects of the same underlying reality, which he referred to as the élan vital, or the vital impulse. Foucault believed that knowledge is not objective but rather is produced and constructed by social, political, and historical forces. Bergson argues that the traditional view of matter as a collection of stable, unchanging particles is incomplete. Instead, he proposes that matter is constantly in motion and that its properties are constantly changing. He also argues that the human brain is not a passive recorder of sense data but an active participant in shaping our perceptions of the world. Bergson also introduces his concept of pure perception, which refers to the immediate, unmediated experience of the world that precedes thought and language. He argues that pure perception is the foundation of memory, as it is through our perception of the world that we create the memories that form the basis of our consciousness. Bergson also explores the relationship between memory and time, arguing that the past is not simply a collection of isolated events but is constantly being recreated in the present. His arguments imply that our memories are not stored in our brains like files in a computer but are instead constantly being modified and updated as we interact with the world. Works in science area giving insight to unify the material and mind process. In flash memory chips, each memory cell consists of a transistor that can trap and store electrical charges. When data is written to the memory chip, electrical charges are applied to the transistor to represent the binary values, 0 or 1, of the data. The charges can be trapped in the transistor even when power is turned off, allowing the data to be retained. Think of a memory chip as a giant grid with lots of tiny squares on it. Each square can store one bit of information. When we want to store information on the chip, we turn on or off tiny switches inside each square, which either puts an electrical charge in the square or takes it out. When we want to read the data back from the chip, we check each square to see if it has a charge or not. If a small area of square on silicone chip has a charge, we interpret it as a 1, and if it doesn't have a charge, we interpret it as a 0. In the brain, memory is stored in networks of neurons, which are cells that communicate with each other through electrical and chemical signals. These networks are connected in complex patterns and pathways, and they work together to store and retrieve memories. Memory works by creating connections between neurons, which are called synapses. Deep learning neural networks are inspired by the structure and functioning of the human brain. Both use interconnected nodes to process information. In the human brain, neural networks communicate through electrochemical signals, whereas in artificial neural networks, information is processed through mathematical operations performed by individual nodes. These energies, whether electrical charges in artificial intelligence neural networks or chemicals in brain neural networks, it uses matter to form a complex network of relationships, enabling intellect within that flow. In conclusion, Deleuze's rhizome used the structure and operating principle of the brain, and since new information is not an additional defining substance but a flow of energy and matter. Thus, it is created due to the overall relationship. I think their critique of Deleuze needs more refinement. We will continue our discussion about it in the next video. Bye for now. Thanks.